Michael Johnson had spent the entire day driving, weaving through the streets of town, delivering packages to homes and businesses. It was a job that paid the bills, though it wasn't always easy. His back ached from hours in the driver's seat, and his mind drifted to the simple pleasure of finally getting home, kicking off his shoes, and sinking into his worn-out couch. Just one more stop, he thought, pulling his van to the curb in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. The sun had begun its descent, stretching golden light across the well-manicured lawns and casting long shadows over the driveways. He rubbed his tired eyes and reached for the last package, a small cardboard box that felt light in his hand. Just as he stepped out of the van, something strange caught his attention. It was the smell. Not the usual suburban scents of fresh-cut grass or grilling burgers. This was different. A sharp, acrid scent, unmistakable. Smoke. His brow furrowed as he glanced around, his senses suddenly on high alert. The smell wasn't coming from someone's backyard fire pit or an overcooked meal. It was something more serious. His gaze locked onto a house just a few doors down. Thin tendrils of black smoke curled upward from the roof, dissolving into the evening sky. A shiver of unease ran down his spine. Maybe someone had already called the fire department. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. But then, through the thickening silence of the neighborhood, he heard something, a faint, crackling sound, and then something else, a weak cry, muffled, barely there. His stomach clenched. Someone was inside. Michael turned to see if anyone else had noticed, but the street remained eerily still. Behind curtains and blinds, he sensed people watching but not moving. Wasn't anyone going to do something? His heart pounded as he took a step closer. He wasn't a firefighter. He wasn't a hero, but he was here, and right now, that might be enough. He could almost hear his mother's voice in the back of his mind, reminding him of the lesson she had taught him when he was young. Do what's right, even when no one else does. He swallowed hard. His feet carried him forward before his mind could protest. He didn't know exactly what he was about to do, only that he couldn't stand there and do nothing. The heat grew more intense as he neared the front yard. He could see the glow now, flickering through a second-story window. Every second counted. Would you have done the same? Would you have stood frozen, waiting for help? Or would you have charged forward, uncertain but determined? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe in everyday heroes like Michael, don't forget to like and share this story. Taking a deep breath, he sprinted toward the house, knowing there was no turning back now. Michael barely registered the hesitant voices around him, warning him to wait for the fire department. His mind was already made up. There was no time for hesitation. Someone was trapped inside, and he couldn't stand by and do nothing. His heart pounded as he scanned the house for the quickest way in. The front door was out of the question. The flames licking the frame made that clear. He had to find another way. His eyes landed on a side window, slightly ajar but clouded with thick smoke. Without another thought, he grabbed a nearby planter, lifted it above his head, and smashed it against the glass. The sound of shattering echoed through the street, a stark contrast to the eerie silence of the watching neighbors. Without pausing, he used his arm to brush away the jagged shards still clinging to the frame, ignoring the sting as a few small cuts opened along his skin. The moment he hoisted himself over the windowsill, the heat hit him like a wave, searing and suffocating. Smoke curled into his nostrils, making him cough violently. His vision blurred, but he forced himself forward. He had heard someone struggling, a wheezing, barely audible plea for help. That sound alone propelled him deeper inside. He dropped to a crouch, trying to stay below the densest smoke. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning wood and fabric, the heat pressing against his skin like a relentless force. He could hear the fire spreading, the creaking and cracking of weakening walls, the distant sound of glass breaking. But nothing mattered except finding the person who needed him. Crawling through what seemed like a living room, his hands brushed against overturned furniture, the carpet singed beneath his fingers. He moved blindly, trusting his instincts, until he reached the hallway. The voice, soft, weak, was coming from there. He pressed forward, feeling along the walls, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. A door to his left. He tried the handle locked, He banged on it. "Hello? Can you hear me?" A faint, wheezing cough was his only answer. Without hesitation, he backed up and threw his shoulder into the door. It didn't budge. Gritting his teeth, he tried again, this time putting all his weight behind it. The frame groaned before finally giving way, and Michael stumbled inside. The bedroom was filled with smoke, the dim glow of fire from the hallway barely illuminating the space. Through the haze, he spotted a figure on the floor, an elderly woman, her frail body curled up, struggling to lift her head. Michael rushed to her side, dropping to his knees. "I've got you," he murmured, slipping an arm beneath her shoulders. She was barely conscious, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to see him, her lips moving without sound. He didn't waste time. He needed to get her out. Tightening his grip, he lifted her as gently as he could, feeling her body tremble in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but still, the effort sent a sharp strain through his back. He pushed past the pain. "Hold on," he said, unsure if she could even hear him. The flames behind them crackled louder, a new burst of heat rushing through the room. The fire was spreading faster than he had anticipated. He turned, bracing himself, and started toward the exit, every step feeling like an eternity. Michael could barely see through the thick smoke that clouded the air, burning his eyes and making every breath a struggle. The heat was unbearable, waves of it pressing against his skin, but he couldn't let that stop him. Eleanor was lying on the floor, her frail body barely moving, her shallow breaths the only sign that she was still alive. Kneeling beside her, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, can you hear me? We need to get out of here," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering, but she was too weak to respond. Michael knew there was no time to waste. He slipped one arm under her back and another beneath her knees, lifting her carefully. She was light, almost weightless, but even so, his muscles strained under the effort. He adjusted his grip, cradling her against his chest as he stood up, trying to steady his breath. A sudden crash from another part of the house made him flinch. The fire was consuming everything in its path. He could feel the floor growing hotter beneath his feet, the wood groaning under the weight of the flames. He had to move fast. Turning back toward the broken window, he tightened his hold on Eleanor and began navigating the smoke-filled room. Each step was uncertain. He had to be careful not to trip over fallen debris. He pressed forward, his eyes stinging, his lungs burning. Every breath felt like it might be his last. Through the dense haze, he spotted the window he had broken to enter. The opening was small, but it was their only way out. Outside, faint silhouettes of people stood in the yard, shouting for help. He hoped the firefighters would arrive soon, but he couldn't afford to wait. As he reached the window, he shifted Eleanor slightly, positioning her to pass through first. "Someone help me," he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. Two figures moved closer, neighbors, their faces filled with a mix of fear and urgency. They reached their arms in through the jagged opening. Michael braced himself, lifting Eleanor toward them as carefully as he could. The woman let out a weak moan as she was guided through the window and into waiting hands. He exhaled in relief as he watched them gently lay her down on the cool grass. But now, he had to get himself out. A sudden burst of flames flared behind him, illuminating the room in a fiery glow. The heat surged against his back, the oxygen in the air rapidly disappearing. He didn't have a second to spare. Gripping the windowsill, he pulled himself up, feeling the jagged glass scrape against his arms. He swung one leg through, then the other, finally landing outside on shaky legs. A pair of strong hands grabbed him, steadying him before he could collapse. He turned to look at Eleanor. Paramedics had already rushed to her side, placing an oxygen mask over her face. She was breathing. She was alive. Michael fell to his knees, coughing violently, the cool night air rushing into his lungs. His body trembled from exhaustion, but relief washed over him. He had done it. He had saved her. But as he sat there, catching his breath, he realized something else. He had just risked everything for a woman he didn't even know. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The moment he passed Eleanor through the window, Michael felt a sudden vibration in the floor beneath him, followed by a loud, deafening crack. He turned just in time to see part of the ceiling collapse, flames bursting through the opening like a wave of molten destruction. Embers scattered through the air, some landing on his shirt, the fabric smoldering before he frantically patted it out. The heat was unbearable now, and the air had turned thick with choking smoke, making every breath a struggle. He had to get out. The window was now his only chance. The walls trembled as the fire spread, consuming everything in its path. Michael took a step toward the opening, but stumbled as a piece of charred wood fell from above, grazing his shoulder. He hissed at the sudden pain but forced himself to move forward. He could hear the voices outside calling his name, urging him to hurry, but the fire roared louder, drowning them out. Reaching the window, he grabbed the frame, now hot to the touch, and hoisted himself up. The jagged edges of broken glass dug into his skin, but he ignored it, focusing only on the cool air outside. His muscles burned from exhaustion, but he managed to swing one leg over the sill. Just as he did, another section of the house groaned ominously, and before he could process what was happening, the floor beneath him gave way. He barely had time to react. His hands instinctively tightened around the window frame as his lower body plunged downward, a searing rush of heat rising up from below. The drop wasn't far, but the force of it sent a sharp jolt through his arms. His grip slipped momentarily, but he gritted his teeth and pulled himself up with all the strength he had left. The fire was inches away now, licking at his boots, trying to drag him down. He wouldn't let it. With one last desperate push, he threw himself forward, clearing the window just as the room behind him was engulfed in flames. He tumbled onto the ground, rolling onto his side as fresh air finally filled his burning lungs. Strong hands grabbed him, pulling him further away from the collapsing house. Someone was shouting, but his ears were ringing too loudly to make out the words. He coughed violently, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling from exhaustion. Through blurred vision, he saw Eleanor lying a few feet away, an oxygen mask pressed to her face as paramedics worked to stabilize her. She was alive. That was all that mattered. A hand clapped his shoulder, and he looked up to see a firefighter kneeling beside him. "You did good, man," the firefighter said, his voice steady. Michael nodded weakly, unable to find the words. He had made it out. They both had. As he lay there, listening to the distant wail of sirens and watching the house succumb to the flames, he realized how close he had come to never making it out at all. He had taken a chance, and it had nearly cost him everything. But looking at Eleanor, still breathing, still here, he knew without a doubt that he would do it all over again. Michael lay on the grass, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull clean air into his lungs. His throat burned from the smoke, each cough rattling his ribs. His body trembled, a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline still surging through him. The cool night air felt shocking against his overheated skin, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on the scene unfolding around him. Firefighters charged past him, their boots thudding against the pavement as they worked to control the roaring blaze. Water gushed from hoses, steam hissing as it met the flames. The house, what was left of it, crackled angrily, embers flying into the air like fireflies. Paramedics swarmed Eleanor. She lay motionless, an oxygen mask pressed over her face as they checked her vitals. One of them spoke into a radio, relaying her condition to someone else. Michael strained to hear, but could only catch snippets: low oxygen, dehydration, smoke inhalation. His stomach clenched. Had he been too late? Had he pulled her out only for her to slip away now? A movement in the crowd caught his attention. Neighbors, once hidden behind curtains and doorways, had gathered on the sidewalk. Their expressions ranged from awe to disbelief. A man in a button-up shirt, likely one of the homeowners, shook his head. "I wouldn't have done that," he muttered under his breath, glancing at Michael. Michael wiped the soot from his forehead with a shaky hand and exhaled slowly. He hadn't done it for recognition. He hadn't even thought. He had just done what felt right. The idea of standing back, of watching someone suffer when he could help, was never an option in his mind. Another neighbor, an older woman in a light sweater, stepped forward. "That was brave, son," she said softly, her voice filled with both gratitude and concern. "You could have been killed." Michael offered a small, weary smile. "She was in there. I couldn't just leave her." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. "Well, thank God you didn't." A firefighter approached, his yellow suit streaked with soot. "You the guy who went in?" he asked, his voice gruff, but not unkind. Michael nodded. "That was reckless," the firefighter continued, shaking his head slightly. "But damn if it wasn't one of the bravest things I've seen." Michael shifted, trying to sit up a little straighter, though his body protested. The firefighter crouched next to him, offering a bottle of water. "Drink," he ordered. "You need it." Michael took the bottle gratefully, his hand still unsteady as he twisted off the cap, and took a sip. The cool water was a relief against his parched throat. The firefighter watched him for a moment before nodding. "She's gonna be okay," he said, jerking his head toward Eleanor. "You got her out in time." Relief flooded Michael so fast it made him lightheaded. He looked over at Eleanor, still receiving medical attention, but now there was movement, a flutter of her eyelids, a slow but deliberate breath beneath the mask. She was alive. A police officer approached, notebook in hand. "Need to get a statement from you," he said, his tone professional but tinged with curiosity. "Can you tell me what happened in your own words?" Michael nodded slowly and recounted the events, his voice hoarse but steady. He told them about the smoke, the faint cry for help, the desperate search through the burning home. He didn't embellish anything. He didn't need to. The truth was already more than enough. When he finished, the officer jotted down a few more notes and gave him a long look. "Not many people would have done what you did," he said finally. "You put your own life on the line." Michael just shrugged. "She needed help." The officer nodded, clearly impressed. "Well, if you ever decide to change careers, I think we could use a guy like you." Michael chuckled weakly, unsure what to say. He wasn't a hero. He was just someone who had refused to stand by. More voices filled the night air. Reporters had arrived, cameras flashing, microphones being prepped. Someone must have called them, and now they were closing in, eager for a story. Michael tensed. He had no desire for the spotlight. Before he could react, a paramedic knelt beside him. "Let's get you checked out," she said, her tone firm but kind. "You inhaled a lot of smoke." Michael wanted to protest, but he didn't have the energy. He let them guide him toward the ambulance, past the gathering reporters, past the whispering neighbors. As he sat on the edge of the open ambulance, an oxygen mask pressed to his face, he watched the scene unfold. The fire was finally under control. Eleanor was being loaded into another ambulance, but her hand moved slightly. Maybe just a reflex, but enough to reassure him. He let his head rest against the cool metal wall behind him, exhaustion creeping in now that the adrenaline was wearing off. His mind drifted to thoughts of what tomorrow would bring. Would anyone remember what he did? Or would life move on, the way it always does? He wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. Tonight, he had made a difference. And that was enough. Michael was finishing his morning coffee, the rich aroma mixing with the crisp air of the early morning. His body still ached from the events of the previous night, but the soreness was nothing compared to the satisfaction of knowing Eleanor was safe. He glanced at the clock, realizing it was almost time to head out for work. He sighed, mentally preparing for another long day, when the sound of a car pulling up outside caught his attention. He stepped to the window, curiosity piqued. A sleek black sedan, the kind he rarely saw in his modest neighborhood, had come to a smooth stop in front of his home. The doors opened, and a well-dressed man emerged, his tailored suit and polished shoes standing in stark contrast to the cracked pavement. Michael's eyes widened when he recognized the woman stepping carefully out of the passenger seat. Eleanor. She looked frail, but her eyes held warmth and gratitude as they met his. A cane supported her steps, and Michael could see the lingering effects of smoke inhalation in the way she moved carefully, as if every breath was a deliberate effort. But she was there, standing on his front lawn, very much alive. Michael opened his front door, stepping out onto the porch, Feeling suddenly self-conscious about his worn jeans and faded work shirt, the well-dressed man approached him first, extending a firm hand. Michael Johnson. His voice was smooth, authoritative yet kind. Michael nodded, shaking his hand. "Yes, sir. I'm David Reynolds," the man said. "Eleanor's son. I believe you already know my mother." Michael looked toward Eleanor, who smiled warmly. "Michael," she said, her voice softer than he remembered. "We had to come see you. I needed to thank you properly." Michael gestured toward the chairs on his small porch. "Please have a seat. Can I get you anything? Water, coffee?" David waved a hand. "No, we won't take up much of your time. But my mother was determined to come here today." Eleanor settled into the chair, sighing as if relieved to rest. "I don't remember much from that night, Michael. But I remember the moment I woke up in that ambulance, and the first thing I asked was, 'Who saved me?' They told me about you." Her gaze softened. "You didn't hesitate. You went in when no one else did. You saved my life." Michael shifted in his chair, suddenly feeling the weight of her words. "I just did what anyone would have done." David shook his head. "No, Michael. Most people wouldn't have done what you did. I know that. I've seen that. People hesitate. They let fear take over. And sometimes that hesitation costs lives." He leaned forward. "That's why I wanted to meet you." Michael frowned slightly, unsure of where this was going. "I appreciate that, but really, I was just in the right place at the right time." David studied him for a moment before nodding. "Maybe, but I think there's more to it than that. And I think you deserve more than just a thank you." Michael's brow furrowed. "I'm not sure I follow." David reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black envelope. He handed it to Michael, who hesitated before taking it. Inside was a neatly folded document. As he unfolded it, his eyes scanned the words, his breath hitching slightly when he realized what it was. "A job offer," Michael murmured, reading through the details. David nodded. "Yes, I run a logistics company, and we need people with courage, people who don't freeze under pressure. I don't know what your plans were before all this, but I want to give you a chance at something better." Michael stared at the document. The salary was more than he had ever made. Full benefits, a structured career path. It was more than just a job. It was a future. Eleanor smiled. "This is the least we could do, Michael. You saved me, and my son believes in rewarding good people." Michael felt his throat tighten. This was unexpected, too unexpected. I don't know what to say." David chuckled. "Take your time. Think it over. But know this isn't charity. I saw something in you, and I think you could do great things. You just need the opportunity." Michael looked between them, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I thank you. Really. I'll think about it." David stood, offering his hand again. "That's all we ask. Take your time, but don't sell yourself short." Michael shook his hand, still processing everything. Eleanor reached for his hand too, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Thank you, Michael, for everything." As they returned to their car, Michael watched them drive away, the black sedan disappearing down the street. He looked back at the job offer in his hands, exhaling slowly. Yesterday, he was just a delivery driver. Today, his life might be about to change forever. Michael sat in stunned silence, the weight of the offer pressing on him in a way he had never felt before. A job in management, full benefits. It was more than he had ever dared to dream. For years, he had scraped by, taking whatever work he could to pay the bills and support his mother. Now, in the span of 24 hours, everything had changed. David sat across from him, his expression calm yet expectant, as if he knew Michael would need time to process. "I know this is a lot to take in," David said, his voice steady. "But this isn't charity. It's recognition. People like you don't come around often." Michael swallowed hard, still gripping the job offer in his hands. "I appreciate this, truly. But why me? I don't have any experience in management." David leaned forward slightly. "Experience can be taught. What can't be taught is instinct, bravery, and the ability to act under pressure. You showed all of that the other night. That's the kind of person I want on my team." Eleanor, sitting beside her son, reached for Michael's hand. "We also want to help with your mother's medical bills," she said gently. You saved my life, and I want to do something for you in return. Michael's breath hitched. His mother had been struggling with medical expenses for years, barely able to afford proper care. This offer wasn't just about him. It was about her, about finally giving her the relief she deserved. That's a lot, he admitted, his voice unsteady. I don't know how to thank you. By accepting, David said simply. By letting us give you the chance you deserve. Michael looked down at the papers in his hands again, his thoughts racing. What would this mean? A stable career, real financial security, a way out of the cycle he had been trapped in. But could he step into a world so different from the one he knew? Could he truly succeed? I won't lie to you, Michael, David continued. This job won't be easy. You'll have to learn quickly, adapt, and prove yourself. But something tells me you're more than capable of that. Michael exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling over him. And my mother's medical bills, you're serious about that? Eleanor squeezed his hand. Completely. We've already spoken to the hospital. Everything is arranged. She won't have to worry anymore. The words hit him like a tidal wave. He felt the tightness in his chest ease, a burden lifting in a way he never thought possible. His mother wouldn't have to choose between medication and groceries anymore. She wouldn't have to carry the stress alone. Okay, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, and met David's gaze. I'll do it. I'll take the job. David grinned, standing up and offering his hand. Welcome aboard, Michael. Michael shook it firmly, his mind still reeling. This was real. This was happening. A new beginning was unfolding before him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. Michael adjusted his tie, the unfamiliar fabric slightly stiff against his neck. He had never needed to wear anything like this for work before. His hands trembled slightly as he smoothed out his dress shirt, his reflection staring back at him in the small mirror by the door. This was it, his first day at his new job. It felt surreal, as if the past few days had been a whirlwind carrying him to a place he never imagined he'd be. As he stepped out of his modest home, he felt a strange mixture of nerves and excitement. The black sedan David had arranged to pick him up was already waiting at the curb. Michael took a deep breath and slid into the back seat. The driver greeted him with a polite nod before pulling onto the main road. The city felt different today, as if he was seeing it with new eyes. For years, he had only driven past these tall buildings, delivering packages to their occupants. Now he was stepping inside as one of them. The headquarters of David's company was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the bright morning sun. Walking through the front doors, Michael's heart pounded. The receptionist smiled warmly, handing him a badge with his name printed neatly on it. "Welcome, Mr. Johnson," she said. He nodded in thanks, tucking the badge into his pocket before following the directions to the training room. A small group of new hires sat around a polished conference table, each of them dressed professionally, some looking just as nervous as he felt. A trainer stood at the front of the room, greeting them as they entered. Michael took a seat, his hands clasped together in his lap, listening intently as the trainer explained the company's mission and values. Training sessions were rigorous, filled with unfamiliar jargon and complex systems, but Michael was determined to absorb everything. He took meticulous notes, asked thoughtful questions, and stayed late to review materials. His experience as a delivery driver had taught him how to think on his feet, how to handle pressure, and how to solve problems quickly. Those skills, he realized, were just as valuable in this corporate setting as they had been on the road. His supervisor, Sarah, noticed his efforts. One afternoon, she pulled him aside. "Michael, you're catching on faster than most. You ask the right questions, and you're not afraid to take initiative. That's going to take you far here." Hearing that filled Michael with a quiet sense of pride. He had doubted himself in the beginning, unsure if he belonged in this world. But every day, he was proving to himself that he did. After a few weeks, he was assigned his first real task, managing a logistics issue with a delayed shipment. He reviewed the problem carefully, analyzing possible solutions before proposing a plan to reroute deliveries efficiently. His supervisor approved his suggestion, and by the end of the day, the issue was resolved. "Nice work, Michael," Sarah said, handing him a printed report of the results. "Your quick thinking saved us a lot of trouble. Keep this up, and you'll be moving up in no time." Michael grinned, nodding. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The job was demanding, but it was also rewarding. He had stability, growth, and a future ahead of him. As he left the office that evening, stepping onto the busy city streets, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. This was just the beginning, and he was ready for. Michael had settled into his new role with surprising ease. Each day brought new challenges, but he met them head-on, proving himself time and time again. The work was demanding, but for the first time in his life, he felt valued, respected, and, most importantly, hopeful about the future. One afternoon, as he finalized a report on a major logistics project, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Well, don't you look important?" He turned, and there she was, Eleanor, standing in the doorway, her smile warm and full of pride. She looked healthier than the last time he had seen her, a glow in her face that hadn't been there before. She still moved cautiously, leaning slightly on her cane, but there was a newfound strength in her posture. Michael stood quickly, his heart swelling with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Eleanor," he said, walking over to greet her. "What a surprise!" She reached out, squeezing his hand. "I had to see it for myself," she said, her eyes scanning the office space. "David told me how well you've been doing. I couldn't be prouder." Michael chuckled, shaking his head. "It still feels a little unreal," he admitted. "Some days I wake up and wonder how I got here." Eleanor gave his hand another squeeze. "You got here because you earned it," she said firmly. "Because you didn't hesitate when it mattered most. You didn't just save my life that night, Michael. You changed your own." Her words hit him in a way he hadn't expected. He had been so caught up in the whirlwind of learning his new job, adapting to his new life, that he hadn't truly reflected on how much had changed. Just weeks ago, he was a delivery driver, barely scraping by. Now he had stability, a career, and people who believed in him. "I just did what I thought was right," he said, his voice quieter now. Eleanor smiled knowingly, and that made all the difference. They sat down together in the small office lounge, sharing a quiet moment as Michael recounted some of his experiences since starting the job. Eleanor listened intently, nodding in encouragement. "I knew from the moment I met you that you were special," she said. "I knew you were capable of so much more than what life had given you up to that point." Michael exhaled deeply, feeling a mix of gratitude and humility. "I don't know if I'd be here without you and David," he admitted. "You both gave me a chance when I didn't even know I needed one." Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "We only opened a door, dear. You're the one who walked through it." Michael smiled, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He looked around at the office, at the bustling energy of the team he was now a part of, and felt a deep sense of contentment. "So, what's next for you, Michael?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head slightly. "What's the next big step?" Michael thought for a moment before answering. I just want to keep growing, keep learning. I finally feel like I have a future I can be proud of. I don't want to waste it." Eleanor beamed. "That's the best answer you could have given." As she prepared to leave, Michael walked her to the front of the building. He opened the door for her, watching as she stepped out into the bright afternoon sun. Before she got into the car waiting for her, she turned back to him. "Promise me something, Michael. Promise me you'll never stop believing in yourself the way we believe in you." Michael nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I promise." Eleanor smiled one last time before getting into the car. As it pulled away, Michael stood there for a long moment, watching until it disappeared down the street. Then, with a deep breath, he turned back toward the office, ready for whatever came next. Michael never imagined how much his life would change because of one decision. He hadn't woken up that morning expecting to be a hero. He was just a delivery driver, going through his routine, thinking about his next stop, his next paycheck, his mother's medical bills. Life had been a cycle of work and worry, never leaving much room for anything else. But when he saw that thin line of smoke curling into the sky, heard the faint cry for help, something inside him refused to look away. At that moment, fear could have stopped him. He could have done what so many others did. Waited, watched, let someone else take responsibility. Instead, he acted. He ran toward danger without knowing what waited for him inside. He shattered a window, pulled Eleanor from the thick smoke, and refused to let the fire take her. That single decision didn't just save her life. It changed his. The ripple effect of one act of bravery is immeasurable. Because Michael chose to act, Eleanor lived. Because she lived, her son, David, saw the man who had risked everything for a stranger. And because David saw something in Michael, he gave him a chance, a real opportunity to rise beyond his circumstances. That moment of courage reshaped Michael's future, transforming him from a struggling delivery driver into a man with a career, stability, and a newfound confidence in his own potential. But perhaps the most profound change was within Michael himself. He had always believed in doing the right thing, but now he understood the power of stepping forward when no one else would. He learned that bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite the fear. It's about choosing to do something when the easy choice is to do nothing at all. How many lives could change with just one decision? How many people hesitate in crucial moments, not realizing that their actions could make all the difference? What would you have done in his shoes? Would you have risked your safety to save a stranger? Or would you have waited, hoping someone else would step in? It's a question worth asking because in the end, the world doesn't change through grand gestures. It changes through everyday acts of courage. Michael's story is a reminder that heroism isn't reserved for soldiers, firefighters, or people in uniform. It lives in ordinary moments, in split-second choices, in the hearts of people willing to step up when it matters most. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's celebrate everyday heroes and the incredible power of one decision to change a life.